after me, of course. I'd like to call the committee to order. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's hearing on advancing our trade agenda and trade with Africa. Before hearing from our witnesses, I'd like to make 3 points. First, we are committed to a seamless bipartisan renewal of AGOA well before its expiration in 15 months. Congressman Rangel and I worked closely in developing this hearing, having jointly selected all the witnesses, and we are cooperating to develop a plan for AGOA's renewal. To improve the program, we are studying possible changes with an eye toward strengthening utilization and effectiveness. We are listening to stakeholders on issues like capacity building, product coverage and rules of origin, eligibility criteria, and graduation, among others, so that we can determine what changes, if any, are appropriate. To assist in our review, we have requested an extensive study from GAO. In addition, as part of this hearing, we are requesting and encouraging additional analysis and suggestions from the public. Second point, to make AGOA more effective, we must help Africa address both political and supply-side barriers to trade. To encourage greater regional and global integration, Africa must remove domestic barriers to trade and investment, including high tariffs, forced localization requirements, legal restrictions on investment, and customs barriers, among others. Supply-side constraints such as poor infrastructure, lack of regional integration, and other obstacles impede AGOA utilization. We are working with Chairman Royce and the Foreign Affairs Committee to develop approaches to assist African countries in maximizing AGOA utilization. For example, earlier this year, the House passed the Electrify Africa Act with strong bipartisan support. I call on the Senate to act quickly on this important legislation. Implementing the recently concluded Trade Facilitation Agreement would also help Africa address supply-side constraints and encourage greater investment from private sector and development banks. I am frustrated that India is blocking adoption of the deal it agreed to last December, harming developed and developing countries alike and threatening the WTO's viability. Third, as we renew AGOA, we should look at ways to deepen and expand our trade relationship with AGOA countries. We should expand our TIFA and BIT programs and seek BITs with regional groupings. As countries become ready, we should begin negotiating FTAs for the most robust trade relationship. At the same time, I am concerned by the EU's efforts to withdraw unilateral preferences and force African countries to sign bilateral agreements. This approach disadvantages U.S. companies seeking to do business in Africa and raises serious policy and development concerns. Finally, the bipartisan TPA bill that I co-sponsored earlier this year with Chairman Camp includes strengthened provisions on capacity building and development. I call on the administration to work with Congress to pass this important legislation. I will now yield to Ranking Member Rangel for the purpose of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's so refreshing to listen to a chairman of the majority to give a statement that I don't have to rebut or contest or to display political eloquence in terms of why I have a different idea. You have really worked hard, not only on this bill, but what's in the best interest of our great country and how we can help these struggling countries that for so long have been neglected. And I cannot think of a better time to do this as the President of the United States has invited 50 heads of the African countries to come, not only to discuss the African Growth and Opportunity Bill, which we have these experts here to share with us, which is the best direction, but also to be able to look at the broad question of what contribution we and other nations can make to be of assistance to the spectacular growth of the economy of these African countries. And as you said, the reports indicate there's some things, a lot of things that we can do better, and working together we would. In addition to having the heads of states, there were 500 young people from Africa that have been coming to the United States in order to learn more about our system, both in the private and public sector. And I can't think of a better way than to improve our relationships with the countries except through their young people. I've seen that you have given permission for Congresswoman Karen Bass to share with us, and I want to thank you for this courtesy because no young, newer member of this Congress has displayed more in terms of hard work, which is the most important thing, but interest in seeing what the United States and what the Congress, and more specifically our committee with the Foreign Affairs Committee, and working together under your leadership can do. And so I want to thank you for your commitment and also thank the witnesses for helping us and directing us to see what we can do better. I truly believe, without exaggeration, that this is a historic time in our international trade policies. The countries of Africa are the last to get on board, and with our help, I'm certain they can catch up. Thank you so much, Chairman Nunes.
I want to thank you, Mr. Rangel. There's no one committed more to getting AGOA passed than yourself. From the time of our first meeting when I became chair of this committee, this was your priority, and we've worked together on this, and there's nothing better than having three witnesses here that we all agree upon. And I want to welcome all three of you. The first witness is Ben Leo, Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development. Our second witness is William McRaith, Chief Supply Chain Officer for PVH Corporation. And our third witness is Witney Schneidman, Senior International Advisor for Africa at Covington and Burlington and a non-resident fellow for the Africa Growth Initiative at the Brookings Institution. Before we recognize our witnesses, let me note that our time is limited this afternoon, so you should limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and members should keep their questioning also to 5 minutes. Mr. Leo, your written statement will be made part of the record, and you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Nunes, Ranking Member Rangel, and other members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss ways to advance the U.S.-Africa trade and investment agenda. This hearing and the broader examination of the African Growth and Opportunities Act, along with other U.S. policy tools, is extremely well-timed. When African leaders and business people come to Washington next week, we all expect them to deliver a very united message that their most pressing objectives are seeking ways to generate more trade and investment with the United States. My remarks today will focus on 4 interrelated points. First, the global competitiveness of African firms is primarily constrained by business climate issues, small market size, and collusive political economy dynamics. Business surveys paint a very clear and very stark picture. The biggest constraints are unreliable and costly electricity, high transport costs and export processing times, and access to capital. Addressing these kinds of factors, even if only on the margins, will have a greater impact on U.S. trade and investment than further expanding AGOA's market access provisions. The key question is determining where and how the U.S. can best incentivize and support reforms by committed African governments. Second, despite clear criteria, AGOA country eligibility decisions have not reflected whether African governments are establishing market-based economies and favorable business climates. AGOA was originally designed as a compact with African governments, founded upon a commitment to sound economic policies, democratic pluralism, and respect for human and labor rights. While Congress created these eligibility criteria equally, successive administrations have implemented them in highly unequal ways. In practice, AGOA eligibility has been used to promote democratic freedoms, which is a good thing, while economic freedoms have been basically ignored in the eligibility determination process. Going forward, Congress should consider conditioning preferential access to the $17 trillion U.S. economy upon business climate reforms. Third, with a few very important exceptions, U.S. trade capacity building programs lack an overarching strategy and have been fragmented and under-resourced. What we often find are a multitude of very small U.S. government agencies providing sporadic and largely insignificant assistance. Moreover, U.S. assistance for regional economic communities has been modest despite their outsized role in facilitating regional integration and helping to address the problem of small market size. On the positive side, the Millennium Challenge Corporation and more recent U.S. initiatives like Power Africa and the little-known Trade Africa initiative are focusing on the right issues and doing a good job. The key is ensuring that they have scale and staying power. Going forward, Congress and the Obama administration should bring greater focus, coordination, and scale to trade capacity building programs in Africa. Lastly, the U.S. government should actively pursue legally binding bilateral investment treaties as an additional way of promoting economic freedoms and greater trade and investment flows. These treaties can encourage investment by providing investors with protections against things like expropriation or discriminatory treatment. However, the U.S. has only ratified 6 treaties with sub-Saharan African countries over time, which covers a mere 7% of regional GDP. And to date, the Obama administration has not yet successfully negotiated a single legally binding investment agreement. Countries like China and Canada have demonstrated that African governments are ready to sign these agreements, including major economies like Nigeria. While our peers and our competitors have been busy inking investment agreements, USTR has been pursuing ineffectual, non-legally binding trade and investment framework agreements. It's time that we focus and stop allocating very scarce government capacity and resources to these inconsequential talk shops and start pursuing real agreements that catalyze much-needed investment flows to the continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Leo. Mr. McRaith, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Nunes, Ranking Member Rangel, and distinguished members of the House and Ways MEANS Trade Subcommittee. On behalf of PVH, I want to thank you for allowing me the opportunity to testify in front of this committee. I've already submitted my written copy for you to read. I'm going to talk from these points and try to remain focused on them. So my name is William McRaith, Chief Supply Chain Officer for PVH. I also sit on the board of the American Apparel and Footwear Association. Colour on PVH. PVH is one of the largest apparel companies in the world. We are headquartered in New York, with distribution sales in other corporate locations in multiple states across the U.S., including Georgia, North Carolina, New Jersey, New York, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee. Among others, our company brands include Calvin Klein, Tommy Hilfiger, Van Heusen, Arrow, Warner's, Izod, and Speedo. And we are directly responsible for 16,000 jobs within the U.S. PVH is a dedicated global corporate citizen. Outside of the U.S., we have 3,000 retail locations and provide more than 14,000 additional jobs. My message today is quite simple. Many parts of Africa are ready. They are primed to receive large investments that will generate the economic growth envisaged by the AGOA founders. To get there, though, AGOA must be renewed as soon as possible and for an extended period of time, including its third country fabric provision. With the right approach, Africa can become a vertically integrated sourcing region for the apparel industry and generate thousands, tens of thousands of jobs and added value to their economies. AGOA was the right trade policy 15 years ago, but it was ahead of its time for business community and for Africa to be able to fully utilize it. However, we are now seeing more mature and democratic countries, better and lasting infrastructure, and more meaningful economic and educational reforms starting to take root. Congress must send an unequivocal signal to the investor and business community by promptly approving a lengthy extension of AGOA. Just a very quick story of our own. In April of this year, PVH, together with several of the largest apparel companies textile manufacturers and sewers conducted an exploratory business mission to this region. I would say many of those companies that went with us were skeptics, they were cynics, they really did not believe it was ready for this type of investment. After visiting sites, looking at infrastructure, and meeting with ministries from different countries, our business delegation came to the realization that some African countries had already laid the foundations necessary to attract significant foreign investment, and were prepared to undertake the commitments necessary to secure socially responsible investors. What we saw in Africa reminded us all of some of the current production powerhouses we are in today and what they looked like 20 years ago. There is great excitement among the apparel business community about this very near growth opportunity in Africa. African nations are on much more of a course than just to become pure seamstresses. They can become the world's very first example of how to proactively build a fully vertical, socially compliant, human rights compliant, ground-to-finished product supply chain. Africa can attract the investment in other added value processes, such as cotton growing, yarn spinning, weaving, and logistics. Countries in Africa will also be the beneficiaries of a more inclusive model of investment and growth in which socially responsible companies like PVH will be able to put in place right from the very beginning facilities, norms, and values that will guide the work at the factories and the relationships between workers, managers, associations, civil society groups, governments, and any other stakeholders. I see my time is low, but I only have 3 more points to make, so if I can just quickly move through them. The U.S. can help us in many ways. One of those programs that will help increase the quality and the yield of Africa cotton. Vocational and educational programs to help train workers and management. Projects that help build inter-regional connectivity for goods to transit the continent seamlessly will enhance the attractiveness of the region. Aside from a lengthy AGOA extension, one way to add the additional certainty for the business community is by extending the third country fabric provision for a reasonable period of time and allow the growth of the investments that will make this third country provision no longer necessary. As someone who has been involved in global operations for over 3 decades and recently had to ponder the question of where is the next growth region for the next 20 to 30 years, I believe that we now have the answer. It is Africa. We must not lose a moment in this tremendous opportunity for Americans and for Africans alike. To make it happen, AGOA must be renewed soon and for a lengthy period of time. In addition, Congress and the administration must continue to work hand in hand to approve and facilitate the creation of programs that will strengthen the Africa region. We look forward to working with the members of this committee, other members of Congress, and with the administration in this worthwhile goal. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Apologies for the time.
Thank you, Mr. McRaith. Mr. Schneidman, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Nunes, Ranking Member Rangel, and distinguished members of the committee, it is an honor to testify before you today. On the eve of the first ever African Leaders Summit, the moment could not be more timely to be considering the renewal and strengthening of the African Growth and Opportunity Act. I will briefly discuss several critical issues related to AGOA, but first it is important to note that AGOA is the cornerstone of the U.S.-African commercial relationship, and it provides the U.S. with a strategic advantage on the continent. Over the course of the last 14 years, AGOA has led directly and indirectly to the creation of several million jobs. For a continent of 1 billion people, where the median age is 17, this is a significant contribution to economic growth, social stability, and the emergence of a middle class with a strong appetite for American products and brands. There is also a strong affinity with the way in which American companies do business in Africa in terms of skills development, technology transfer, career enhancement, and respect for rule of law and anti-corruption practices. It is in our strategic interest, therefore, that a renewed AGOA contributes to a deeper U.S. commercial engagement in Africa while also encouraging more exports from beneficiary countries. As for the most critical issues, let me start with the time frame. Most Americans have what might be referred to as a pre-dial-up perception of Africa. In other words, their views of Africa continue to be informed by the Cold War, before the Internet, when coups, conflict, and corruption were rife. There is little appreciation for the rapid growth, the significant improvement in governance, and the emergence of a middle class on par with that of India and China. In order to change how American companies view Africa, there can be no higher priority than creating a framework of stability and predictability for entering the African market. The same is equally true for African and other companies navigating the complexities of exporting to the U.S. market under AGOA. All of them need assurances of a stable and sustainable set of commercial rules. For that reason, I support the African Union in its call for a 15-year extension of AGOA from 2015 to 2030. Now, many American companies, especially small and medium companies, need support to be successful in Africa. African companies generally need assistance to find buyers in the U.S. and comply with U.S. regulations. The architects of AGOA anticipated some of these problems and created 3 trade hubs, not only to help African companies enter the U.S., but also to facilitate American companies. The architects of AGOA anticipated some of these problems and created 3 trade hubs to help African companies utilize AGOA. The time has come there, however, to redefine the role of the trade hubs. They need to be restructured into trade and investment hubs, so they not only help African companies enter the U.S., but also facilitate American companies to capture market share on the African continent. To do this, the newly fashioned trade and investment hubs should become one-stop shops where the trade promotion activities of our embassies, officials from the Departments of Commerce and Agriculture, EXIM and OPEC, are closely aligned on a daily basis in support of enhancing the U.S. commercial presence on the continent. For this to happen, the administration would have to commit to a whole-of-government strategy for trade promotion in Africa, which unfortunately has been lacking. Congress would have to play its part and make the funding available. This should be pursued with a sense of urgency, given the competitiveness of companies from China, India, the EU, and elsewhere in Africa. Now, it is often said that capital is a coward, which explains why Africa accounts for only 1% of U.S. investments worldwide, which is a shockingly low number. As part of a reauthorized AGOA, Congress should establish a tax incentive to help change the risk-reward ratio for American companies. By reducing the tax to zero on repatriated income by U.S. companies who make new job-creating investments in supply chain products in agriculture, manufacturing, apparel, technology, clean energy, and other relevant sectors, Congress and the administration would reduce the risk for American companies to invest in Africa. I'd just like to touch on 1 or 2 more points quickly as I see my time is running out. No issue is as central to Africa's accelerated economic development as regional economic integration. The U.S. has largely understood this, but we can do more to facilitate the flow of goods, services, and labor across Africa's borders. The principal challenge to regional integration comes from an unlikely source, and it is the economic partnership agreements which the European Union is compelling African governments to sign by October 1st, or African governments face losing their preferential access to the European market. In fact, the EPAs threaten to undermine much of the progress that has been made on regional integration, as they would give European goods and services preferential access in an African country over goods and services from a neighboring African country. They would also discriminate against American companies and products. The EPAs present a significant challenge to the U.S., as the U.S. is poised to negotiate regional free trade agreements throughout Africa, while we are discussing today the extension of a non-reciprocal trade benefits program with 40 countries on the continent. While it is essential that we renew AGOA, we should address this issue of this profound asymmetry. Last year, the U.S. exported $24 billion worth of goods and services to Africa. This translates into support for more than 130,000 jobs in the U.S. So our relationship with Africa is changing from one of donor-recipient to one of mutual gain and benefit. Under AGOA, in 2013, the U.S. imported nearly $5 billion worth of non-oil, largely job-creating goods, almost 4 times the amount in 2001. In both respects, these trends are encouraging, but with a 15-year extension of AGOA, these trends can become much, much stronger. Thank you for the opportunity and the extra time.
Thank you, Mr. Schneidman. Because of the ranking member's long-time concern about AGOA, and he's really been the champion in Congress, I'm going to yield my time to the chairman so that he can get into the questions.
I can't thank you enough for your courteous consideration, and I want to thank the witnesses for their contribution. Legislatively, time is not on our side this year, and we have a lot of things to consider as to whether or not the 15 years, even though it would give investors some degree of continuity. We certainly don't want to put these countries in a box that we can't revisit and see what changes have to be made. We also know that the third country origin of fabric is the easiest way that a lot of them want to go, but we also know that we want to provide incentives so that they would not have to go outside of these countries. In the Congress, as you well know, we have separated into different committees and subcommittees, and most of the testimony appears as though you think our executive branch is that separated too. And I want to get whatever suggestion you can make. Here we are, a country trying to maintain peace and economic stability in the world, and we have an opportunity of people who are basically friendly to us. They are in need. They want to trade. And whether or not it's bilateral, or whether it's not this broad, which agency do you think would be the best to coordinate these activities so that whether we're talking about diplomacy, whether we're talking about security, whether we're talking about education, whether we're talking about electricity and infrastructure, when a patient is sick, they don't want to know the specialist. They want to know generally, what are you doing to help me? And everything that you said, it sounds like all of us would say we wish we have thought about it, but our committee does not have the expertise. We don't have the experience to know how to go about this, even though we are there to provide the tax incentives and the structure. So could you, any one of you, suggest to us, since we cannot do it this year, a lot of us will be attending the conference. We will have very little input because it's an executive conference, even though we will have the opportunity to talk with the representatives of these countries. What could we recommend to our executive branch as a result of this hearing, which the chairman called so that we would have the hearing before the summit? We won't be able to tell them we have a treaty to be signed, but we should be able to tell them something before they tell us. What recommendations, Mr. Leo, since you had 4 points, who would coordinate, assuming they thought they all made sense like I did? What agency? It certainly wouldn't be the UFTR.
Thank you, sir, for the comments and the question. I agree with you with the point in terms of a need for very close coordination and a strategy to be developed, implemented, monitored with a single agency on the hook for accountability. And given the breadth of the issues that are very important and influential to all the matters that we're talking about, and the fact that there are so many different government agencies that have a small little piece, sometimes a medium-sized piece, I think given that, it has to be driven out of the White House within the executive branch. And as a person who served at the White House in the past on the National Security Council, I can understand how that vehicle is required. So I think it's got to be the White House that drives it. USTR can be the lead on a couple of the issues. They can lead along with the State Department on bilateral investment treaties. They can lead on AGOA. USAID and MCC can lead on some of the softer trade capacity building assistance. But what we have right now is a lack of an overarching strategy that has a continental, regional, and country-specific approach to it. So I think first, White House needs to be the driving force. Two, need to have a strategy, including on trade capacity assistance. And then three, have within at least the executive branch, budgetary authority attached to it. Obviously, Congress will have the final say on where the money comes and goes, but within the requests needs to have some of that authority attached to it, because money is what's going to drive things on a lot of these vehicles. And then lastly, at the country level, I think the U.S. ambassador needs to be in a position to approve all of the government agency actions that involve this agenda, and that's hit or miss right now. Sometimes that happens, but I think the ambassador has got to be the final say for country-level activity. But back here in Washington, it's got to be driven by the White House. We haven't had that these last 14 years, and we need to have that going forward, whether it's investment, trade, and policy, as well as trade capacity building assistance.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, after the members all have an opportunity to inquire, I'd like to hear from the other two witnesses. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Rangel. Now recognize Mr. Reichert for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry I missed some of your testimony. We all have other venues we have to run to and come back to. I want to follow up, I think, on a little bit of what Mr. Rangel was talking about. I'm guessing we're going to be heading in the direction of some strategies, but specific to a certain issue of growing exports. So I support a timely, seamless renewal of AGOA, and all of us do. In recent years, some countries have begun to develop AGOA export strategies that identify measures that can be taken to promote greater use of AGOA benefits. An example of that would be Kenya has developed a national AGOA strategy focused on diversifying its exports, easing barriers to exporting, and further strengthening ties with the United States and U.S. businesses. Specifically, this includes looking at ways to improve infrastructure, increase exposure by raising the profile of Kenya products, and reduce burdensome regulations. The problem is that most countries still don't develop these strategies or look at AGOA strategically. And you mentioned some of your strategic issues: continental, regional, country, the ambassador's involvement, and the involvement of the president. I'm guessing that all of those components certainly would apply to helping in this arena. But is there anything that's more specific to encouraging other countries to sort of follow the pattern that Kenya has sort of presented? Anyone?
Thank you very much for that. I think a very important question. The annual U.S. AGOA Forum, I think, provides a great opportunity for every country to come forward with their national AGOA export strategy. And I think we've seen where certain countries, are using the internet much more effectively, and certain governments are using the internet much more effectively to post contracts in the natural resource sector. And I think that we can make a concerted effort in our dialogue with AGOA beneficiaries, not only to have them develop national strategies on AGOA exports, but to post them on the ministries of trade. And maybe they can also be posted on agoa.gov, our UST, our website. And if these AGOA strategies are developed in the right way, the result of a consultation between local private sector, civil society, government, other stakeholders, I think they can be terribly effective. So I would like to see over the next 2 or 3 years that every AGOA beneficiary come forward with a national strategy that we can understand and that we can measure progress against.
Other comments?
Yeah, I would add 1 or 2 things to that. I think underlying your excellent question is African governments have the ultimate responsibility to come forward with their own strategies that will build upon and seize the opportunity of preferential access to the U.S. market. And within that, I think the U.S. government should be prioritizing its engagement and its very scarce assistance dollars on those governments that have demonstrated a strong commitment to reforms and action. So in the case of Kenya coming forward with its strategy and hopefully taking very concerted actions as well, I think that's a great indication of a strong partner for the U.S. to engage with and support through a variety of different tools. So I think the first action has to come from African governments. Within that context, on our side, going a little bit further than what I mentioned before, when we are thinking about trade capacity building assistance, I think there's a great opportunity to work within these strategies, and if required, to supplement them with constraints analysis, growth and trade constraints analysis. I mentioned the political will to implement reforms. I have to look at that. Opportunities at the sector level for greater trade, as well as the ability to attract investment. I think it's those kinds of things that need to be guiding principles when we are determining where scarce resources should go. But it all needs to flow from governments stepping up and coming forward with strategies, but more importantly than strategies, action.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Reichert. Mr. Neal is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rangel and I think, were the only 2 here when this was actually signed into law, and we were original supporters of AGOA, and the result has been encouraging, not just on the engagement front, but on the economic playing field as well. It's been estimated that there have been 1.3 million jobs created in sub-Saharan Africa, and U.S. trade with AGOA nations has grown by 300%, from $7.6 billion in 2001 to $24 billion last year. But there remain significant barriers to trade with Africa, including high tariffs, forced localization requirements, legal restrictions on investment, and custom barriers, amongst other issues. I think that there will be an opportunity when we look to extend AGOA to address some of these issues in a vigorous manner. But Dr. Schneidman, let me speak specifically to a question you raised in terms of how repatriation might spur job creation. As you know, that argument over repatriation has been offered in a flat and round manner in this town for a considerable period of time, and it's in the background of much of the public debate. Many argue that repatriation would rescue a lot of money that's sitting offshore with tangible assets that could be better used here at home. But there's another debate as well that corresponds to it, suggesting that essentially if we do any sort of repatriation right now, you'll never get tax reform. People will just wait once again for a tax holiday, and inversions will continue to move along at the pace that they're currently embracing. So I would give you some time to explain your repatriation proposal.
Congressman Neal, thank you very much for that very important question. You know, this is an idea that actually a number of us have been considering for a long time. And there's several components to the answer. One, I think we should think of a tax credit, a tax incentive, as a spur to economic development in Africa, much like in Puerto Rico in the 1990s. We used a tax incentive to attract American investment there. I think the same dynamic would occur in Africa. There are going to be some 40 million jobs shifting from China and elsewhere to Africa by 2040. And I think U.S. companies need to be part of that. And if we go to zero on a tax incentive, that would be a signal to the tens of thousands of American companies who continue to see Africa as a continent of crisis, that there's something different going on there. And I think that would help American companies get into the game on the continent in a very constructive way. And if they start making investments in agricultural investments, in manufacturing, in technology, I think that'll have profound implications for economic development in Africa. And I don't think it would be zero-sum for the United States. I don't think it would be taking jobs away. And it would provide an incentive not only to invest, but if it's invested in a job-creating project on the continent, generates a profit, that money comes home, and it's used constructively to invest in jobs here, I think that's a win-win. And I think we have to move to a new paradigm. We have that opportunity now with the reauthorization to ask the question, how do we get more U.S. investment into Africa? And I think we do that by lowering the risk and increasing the return for American companies. And I think that would be the kind of incentive that would help American companies transfer technology, create jobs, deepen our connection with a continent that is rapidly emerging and a continent with whom we have little contact and with whom we should have much, much more. So I think it would cost very little. We've done some studies on that, and I think the return would be quite significant, and it would build on the good trust that we have with many African governments, and they would see that we are truly committed to moving to this new relationship, one of mutual benefit, where we can talk about a mutual partnership in a number of areas, not only economic development.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Mr. Buchanan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Chairman Rangel for his leadership. I know you've put a lot of energy, as the chairman mentioned, so I appreciate your effort. And I agree with you. It's nice that we can find a way to come together once in a while. I like that for the sake of America. Let me just mention, we all have seen the numbers about the jobs and the threefold growth. I've had an opportunity in the last probably 3 years. I've been in 10 different African countries, most of them that have AGOA. And the general feeling over there is there's not a lot of enthusiasm on their side, and frankly, there's not a lot of enthusiasm on our side. I think this has to be looked at in a much broader context. We need to really engage the administration, get more involved. I had met a couple equity companies from New York that were in Indonesia, not Indonesia, but Ethiopia, and wrong continent. But the bottom line is they were doing very well. They were in cement and block. They don't have access to capital. And as you mentioned about China, it was my observation, pretty much every country I was in, China was building facilities, primarily palaces and government facilities for a lot of different places all over Africa. It was pretty universal from that standpoint. We're making a commitment more in terms of health care and other things that we're involved in. But I think it's an enormous opportunity. I think 3 times the amount of growth from $8 billion to $25 billion is not exceptional. I think there's a real opportunity to go forward, but we really need to take a look at AGOA in general. I can just tell you, and like I said, I don't mean to be redundant, but it was pretty universal talking with a lot of the heads of states and business people over there. They liked it, thought it was okay, but not great. And I think we really need to take a look at what more we could be doing. So my question, I guess, to all the panelists, what are a couple of things that you would recommend that we might do going forward to make the difference, to bring some more enthusiasm? because I'd like to see us build a better partnership with Africa, and there's other countries like China and others that are fully engaged over there, and we don't want to find ourselves in 5 or 10 years in third place. So, Mr. Leo, what's your thoughts?
Thank you, sir. I think you raise what is a very core fundamental question about our U.S. policy towards this very strategic and dynamic region. In direct response to your question, I think there's a couple of things that we could do that would bring our engagement and our relationship to a higher level. First, before going into the specifics, though, it's not surprising that you've heard from the heads of state that you've met with about the need for economic engagement. When you look at existing surveys of ordinary African citizens, over 70% of them across the continent cite economic-related issues as their most pressing concerns that they want to have their governments focus on, and as you would expect, as related to that, their external partners. I mean, this is the issue. African leaders are totally focused on it. So as a result, along with the very significant opportunities now and in the future, this is where we should be focusing our attention much more than we are today. So what are the pieces? One, I think a seamless extension of AGOA. I think that's pretty straightforward. I don't think there's a lot of controversy on that. Two, the pieces that I mentioned before in terms of making our trade-related assistance much more strategic and focused on the most pressing constraints to firms' ability to be globally competitive. Three, following the leadership out of the House with the Electrify Africa Act, focusing on those kinds of constraints, and with that, the reauthorization of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. If African governments and leaders and businesses are focused on attracting investment, OPIC is one of the best ways to do it. We need the Senate to move on the Energize Africa Act, which will do a multi-year reauthorization, but also give OPIC additional tools. They don't need more money. They don't need more appropriations. They need more flexibility and tools to be more effective and scaled. So I would unleash OPIC as another piece. I mentioned bilateral investment treaties. That's another tool that's very low cost. It's just basically a staff and travel expense to be able to do this. It's not billions of dollars. Witney had mentioned the risk profile. Well, BITs are one way of addressing that issue at almost zero cost to taxpayers.
I'd like to get some additional comments, Mr. McRaith.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I don't want to kind of undermine the discussion that's just been had, but what I would maybe go back and focus on is the fact that we are at a moment in time today that is different to where we were 15 years ago. So you could say AGOA failed. I'm not sure what the appropriate terminology is. If you look at my industry, the apparel industry, we refer to $24 billion worth of AGOA-driven trade, only of which $900 million of it is from the apparel sector. A labor-intensive, in fact, generally the first mover, most labor-intensive industry in the world, and has typically led the way into most developing countries. The time is now. It wasn't right 15 years ago, it's right today. So it will be the private sector that actually drive most of this, and we need the on-the-ground ambassadors who in Ethiopia were incredibly supportive of the work that we did there on a recent trip, in Kenya, similar in Uganda. So I think that we've got to help the nations shake off the old AGOA, because I think they languish in it. It didn't work. There's no energy around it. You go to Africa, China's present everywhere.
Everywhere.
Europe is present everywhere. America is MIA at this point. We're missing an action.
That's my point, I think.
But renew AGOA, because everyone is looking. Everyone is ready to go. However, Don't think of September 2015 as the renewal date. The renewal date is today, because it takes us a year to figure out what we're doing there. We're ready to go. We're ready to go. We're ready to move, and this is sitting right in front of us. And quite frankly, if we do not renew AGOA, it's not about the timing of entry, it's about the exit. So
And
that's
probably out of time. But that's good. Do you want a quick comment or just
Quickly, Mr. Schneidman.
Thank you, Congressman. Let me just mention two things. One, I agree fully with the comments right here that we need to get the framework done in place, renew AGOA as quickly as possible. My second point is I think we have to stir people's imagination. And that was done on Sunday when the U.S. African Development Foundation gave 36 grants of $25,000 each to the Washington Fellows who are here as part of the Young African Leadership Initiative. We need to take that to scale. And I think if we can be seen as catalysts of entrepreneurship, catalysts of innovation, that's what America does best. And that's what Africa is so thirsty for. So I think we can play at a number of different levels at the same time, but we just have to get going to do it.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Blumenauer is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the way that you and Mr. Rangel have organized this hearing. I'm sorry I was called away from one, but I had a chance to review the testimony. I appreciated, Mr. McRaith, your reference to sustainability. And there was some acknowledgement of environment. But I want to just seek feedback from each of you because my limited involvement with the African continent, I've only traveled there a few times, although I did get quite an experience from through the eyes of my daughter, who was a Peace Corps volunteer for 2.5 years. And then traveling with her, watching it from the other side, and the conversations I've had with elected officials from Africa, I'm deeply concerned that we use this as an opportunity to put a focus on sustainability, on environmental protection, because some of the most egregious practices imaginable are taking place, and we're watching. I think the case is clear that there is going to be rapid economic development, and there should be. And we certainly are not interested in holding people back, but there are alternative paths. And I would just appreciate any of you elaborating on this point about how we should approach this agreement as a vehicle to highlight sustainable environmental practices, be able to incent the right things, and perhaps a signal to not engage in some of this destructive behavior that we're seeing.
So, Congressman, maybe I can take a cut at a response to that. So, again, I'm going to focus my response around what we refer to as the EAC and Ethiopia, so the northeastern region of Africa. And so there are some givens on sustainability. You're looking at countries between Ethiopia, Kenya, and to some degree into Uganda. And I know Ethiopia is not part of the EAC, but hopefully will be soon. Countries that are virtually 100% sustainable energy today, either hydro, wind, or eventual thermal energy that they will put into place. So already I would say they are ahead of many countries in these manufacturing powerhouses that exist today in the term sustainable. What I would also say is that for 30 years from the demise of the European and the U.S. manufacturing base for the last 30 years, companies like ourselves and those partners that we work with, we've had successes and we've had many failures, but we've learned from every one of those. And, it's sustainability, and just corporate social responsibility, of which sustainability is a part, was a major theme of the trip that we were on. In fact, we had the opportunity to meet with the presidents of Uganda and Kenya and the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, and the simple question that we asked them was, in 10 years from now, How do you want people to perceive the brand of your company? So when people say brand Ethiopia, how will they talk of brand Ethiopia? Because the decisions you make today are going to determine how people think of it in 10 years. And we have processes in place today, the Accord and the Alliance in Bangladesh, where we are retroactively trying to correct some of the things that were not done appropriately. By engaging, not by stepping back and saying there are issues we can't engage, but by actively engaging and bringing the right socially responsible partners to the table, again, I would argue that this will become a showcase in the world as to what sustainability could look like, what human rights compliance could look like, but we will do it through our presence.
I see my time has almost expired, but I would welcome elaboration from any of you on those elements, notwithstanding, for example, in Ethiopia, where they're aggressively pursuing hydro. I mean, there are lots of practices there that gave me pause, that didn't appear to be particularly sustainable, notwithstanding the energy. If there are elements that you see going forward with the agreement in a way that we can provide the right signals and incentives, as well as, I mean, we've been doing a lot of work with, well, illegal logging and having some problems with Peru these days, with what we thought we'd worked out in the Peru Free Trade Agreement. Thoughts that you have that could be incorporated here would be deeply appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bubenauer. Mr. Smith's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for sharing your time and expertise with us today. And I don't want to repeat some of the items that have been addressed by my colleagues. Certainly do want to, though, add perhaps emphasis that I'm encouraged by various efforts that can hopefully build more capacity, and I think there are great opportunities for the future here. And as we do work through the customs challenges and so forth, I'm just wondering about some additional barriers that exist, specifically with South Africa, Nigeria, and members of the South African development community as it relates to unscientific sanitary and phytosanitary and other tariff or non-tariff barriers to agriculture, our agriculture exports. Can you, any of you, reflect on that a bit?
If I may, Congressman, this is an issue that we have looked at carefully, and I think there's a feeling among a number of our poultry producers, for example, that South Africa does practice has unfair practices as it concerns U.S. Poultry products going into the country, and this is a problem. And I think we really need to engage the South Africans in a very sustained and serious way so that we can level the playing field. Because South Africa is a very important partner to the United States. We tried to develop a free trade agreement 2003, 2006, and it didn't work. South Africa has a free trade agreement with the EU. And it suggests to me that we really haven't sorted out our relationship. So there are a number of issues, and I would like to see us really take a step back, engage in a sustained exercise between the U.S. government and the South African government to really chart what our commercial future looks like and how we get to sort of a post-AGOA relationship, because I think it's going to start there, and we haven't done a good job to really embrace that challenge.
Okay. Mr. Leo, in your testimony, you mentioned the preferential access under AGOA should be contingent on noticeable economic improvements. Would you suggest that these improvements would include ironing out these disputes based on the sanitary and phytosanitary, SPS, if you will, standards or various trade policies relating to that?
Thank you, sir, for the opportunity to comment on this. In full transparency, I'm not intimately familiar with this set of issues related to South Africa. In terms of the eligibility requirements, though, more broadly, I think there's a couple of guiding principles that should be applied. If Congress decides and the executive branch decides to go in this direction, I think it needs to be real, and transparent in terms of the principles that would be applied to all countries and would be tracked by third-party data that's public. So it's, in essence, it's apolitical in terms of action has either been taken or it's not been taken. And then along with that, there would need to be a transition period so that African governments actually have the opportunity to address any of the issues that are being tracked and then implemented in the country determination process. Whether the issues that you raised should be a part of those specific criteria that are related to the business climate or other operating climate issues could be debated, could be discussed, and maybe adopted later. At this point, I've focused more in terms of what the guiding principles should be, with specifics that could be fleshed out later if the parties that be decide that this is a sound way to go, which I believe it is in general terms.
Sure, and I would very straightforwardly suggest that the more we can stick to the scientifically based standards, the better off everyone is, whether it's consumers in another country who would consume our products that are safe. We do want to focus on these standards that we've been able, I think, to achieve some progress in ironing these things out with some other countries. But it is something that I think needs addressing, not just with this issue, but others too, as we do move forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentlelady from Kansas, Ms. Jenkins, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. The Peterson Institute forecasts that the Trade Facilitation Agreement could add $500 billion to the GDP of developing countries. Yet India and certain African countries have balked at implementation. For Africa in particular, implementation of the TF Agreement holds potential to reduce barriers to intra-African trade and to promote Africa's integration into global supply chains. We're all watching the upcoming implementation deadlines and hope all countries promptly and fully adopt the TF agreement. And gentlemen, I would just be interested in how would implementation of the TF agreement promote regional integration in Africa and help to address supply side constraints. Mr. Leo?
Thank you for the question, and I think it's a really big, important issue, and it's right now I think it's a quite difficult issue in terms of where those negotiations are and where some of the positions are. I think within the trade facilitation agenda, everyone agrees that it's critical for the issues that you talk about, as well as U.S. businesses to be able to operate. Whenever I talk to U.S. businesses, this is actually their number one issue that they want to get focused on. So I think it would have a big impact. I don't have any great ideas in terms of how to get from where we are now to where we need to be, beyond some just general points about needing to engage with all of the major players who are driving the continental positions that are feeding into the WTO and some of the back channel discussions. But it is an issue that needs to be put behind us as quickly as possible so we can focus on the substance and addressing some of the underlying issues that are holding back or constraining opportunities now and in the future.
Any of you have any additional thoughts?
So I'll give it from a Nepal perspective, because one of the challenges is we often refer to Africa in some cases as if it was a country, and it's clearly a continent of significant size. And what we see within Africa is we see different trade blocs emerging. COMESA, the East Africa Community, SADC has been in place for some time, and we continue to see the growth of those trade groups and our own encouragement. And again, I'd go back to the discussions that we have been having there is, how do we now think of Africa as regionalized, regional locations that include multiple countries that allow trade to free flowly in any direction, so cross-border trade, unrestrained, untaxed, no duty. What I would tell you is, from our perspective in Northeast Africa, we were struck at the level of the commercial ministries and just how focused they were on resolving these cross-border trade negotiations. So we walked away with the rest of the group highly encouraged that where all of Africa might not have free trade movement within it, there were collective regions that this was going to be solved and addressed, and quite frankly, with or without us, it was going to be addressed.
Okay, Mr. Schneidman.
Thank you for the question. Just a brief comment, and I think we need to make progress. We need to move forward in areas where we can make progress. The administration has proposed a trade and investment treaty with the East African community, and I'm hopeful that we're able to conclude that very soon, and then that becomes a model. The benefits of that relationship becomes a model to other regions on the continent that hopefully would provide an incentive of the benefits of working more closely with the United States, because I think that is the most effective demonstration of what the U.S. has to offer as a trading partner.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Young, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership on this issue. Ranking member, appreciate your longstanding interest and leadership on this issue as well. I will be attending.
The gentleman will yield.
Yes.
I forgot to introduce you also that you'll be representing our committee at the AGOA meetings next week, and I want to thank you for that, representing the Republican side.
Happy to do it. And I found your testimony here today quite instructive in preparing me for visiting with some of these African dignitaries and getting some more context and texture with respect to reauthorization. I also, in addition to that duty and responsibility, which I'm happy to have, I'm a co-chair of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Caucus here in Congress. So on a periodic basis, I'll visit with European leaders, diplomats, trade ministers, and so forth, with a few of my other colleagues. So the intersection of U.S.-EU relationships, trade relationships, U.S.-African trade relationships, to me is quite interesting. In fact, we're having a TTIP caucus meeting in less than an hour. And so my line of inquiry here is directly related to that subject matter. In recent years, the EU has pushed African countries out of its own unilateral preference program and into reciprocal bilateral trade agreements. The EU calls them economic partnership agreements. Of particular concern, the tariff preferences in the EU-South Africa EPA have now largely entered into force, and U.S. exporters are at a significant disadvantage in losing market share. The EU is pushing EPAs with many other AGOA members that would further disadvantage U.S. exporters. While Congress has never required that AGOA countries provide reciprocal market access to U.S. exports, the fact that some are now offering this preferential access to the EU, but not the United States, has raised serious concerns. Mr. Schneidman, what can we do to address the EU's actions?
Thank you, sir, for, I think, one of the central questions in U.S.-African and U.S.-EU trade today. I firmly believe that this should be a topic in the U.S.-EU dialogue, in the TTIP negotiations. How is it that we are offering to the Europeans to create the largest free trade area in the world when they are basically compelling African governments to accept these EPAs that basically shut us out of the African market? That's a pretty stark dynamic that's in place, and I'm just stunned that the administration really hasn't embraced that more. And I think really we need to start with the EU, because there has been a lot of opposition in Africa to these EPAs, and many of the African governments really have had no choice but to sign on to these.
Right.
And so I think, we need to engage the African governments as well. I think we need to do this in a U.S.-EU context and a U.S.-African context. But it just stuns me that we're talking about offering non-reciprocal benefits to Africa at the same time that the U.S. or that the EU is talking about a reciprocal relationship. And to Africa's benefit, I think it should be harmonized more directly, and I think the first place to start is in the TTIP negotiations.
Mr. Leo, do you have anything to add to those very
Congress,
helpful remarks?
I don't have a whole lot to add beyond what Witney mentioned. One of my colleagues at the Center for Global Development, Kimberly Elliott, has spent a lot of time looking at exactly these sets of issues, and if you're amenable, I'm sure she would be very pleased to follow up with you with additional thoughts as well.
Okay. Well, I thank you all for being here. I yield back.
I want to thank the gentleman from Indiana and for his active participation in the African continent issues, and we look forward to having a good week next week and hearing back from you. Thank you, Mr. Young. With that, I'd like to thank all the witnesses for their testimony and for the responses to our questions. I think you've given us all much to think about. Our record will be open until August 30th, and I urge interested parties to submit statements to inform the committee's consideration of the issues discussed today. This hearing is now adjourned.